Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board game publishers. A few weeks back, I made a top 10 list about my top 10 favorite board game designers, the creators, the authors, if you will, of all of these amazing games. Now I'll be focusing on the publishers. These are the companies that are responsible for the production, the promotion, and the distribution of these games. They're also responsible for things like the development of the games. They take the core, basic root ideas from the designers and work in the process of completing this and finalizing this in order to give that final product that we enjoy and we get to play. So for this list, I will be sharing my 10 favorite games, my 10 favorite board game publishers, and I'll be sharing a list of games from each of these publishers, highlighting my favorite game from each respective publisher, and also mentioning additional details, things that I like about these companies, and at the same time, some growing edges for each of these companies, areas in which they can improve. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. My number 10 board game publisher is Ravensburger, and there are lots of games from this publisher that I enjoy, including In the Year of the Dragon, Notre Dame, San Juan, La Isla, Castles of Burgundy, the card game, Castles of Burgundy, the dice game, and Castles of Burgundy, the original. And this is actually the game that I'm going to highlight from theirs. This is my favorite game in their catalog. And lots of their games are from Stefan Feld. Stefan Feld definitely has a working relationship with this publisher. As a matter of fact, just recently it was announced that Castles of Burgundy is going to have a Kickstarter for a much updated, prettied up version of the game with a different publisher, different distributor. And I guess that's my growing edge for Ravensburger. They publish lots of great games, but I wish that the aesthetic to their games and their components were a little bit more gratifying. I'm not necessarily someone who depends on that, but from a gameplay perspective, their working relationship with Stefan Feld and lots of his hits, lots of his home runs over the years, they're getting the job done. My number 10 board game publisher, Ravensburger. And now we'll move on to my number 9. And my number 9 is Wizkids. And some of the games that I enjoy from Wizkids is Dice Masters. I own lots of content for Dice Masters, in particular DC Dice Masters, Lords of Waterdeep, classic gateway Euro-style worker placement game with a Dungeons & Dragons theme. Star Trek Fleet Captains and Star Trek Expeditions. They seem to have the license for this intellectual property, and they've made a couple of games with that theme, the Star Trek theme, and I enjoy both of those games. And the game that I like to highlight from WizKids, my favorite game in their catalog, and that's Mage Knight, the very popular solo game among the solo community. People really swear by Mage Knight, although you can play anywhere from 1 to 4 players. I believe you could play 5 players with the expansion, and it's a completely competitive game, although there are cooperative scenarios involved as well. And it's a scenario-based game, as I mentioned, and players are going questing, they're controlling a character, and their character's actions are governed by their deck. And there's a little bit of deck building taking place as players are acquiring additional weapons and spells that they can add to their deck, which will grant their characters additional actions. Really cool. I like how the map unfolds as you explore it. As players progress through the game, the map will spread out and you'll have a better layout of the land. Fun game. I can see all the hype about this game. And before I move on to my number 8, I will say that one of my favorite things about WizKids, one of the reasons why they make it to the list at all, is because I do enjoy their theming. I find that they have really cool thematic intellectual properties that they utilize for their board games. However, I'm not a huge fan of their card stock. Lots of their other components, including their HeroClix miniatures, while they can be a little bit fiddly and what have you, I'm okay with that. But it's the card stock. I don't like the card stock. There's something a little bit flimsy, a little bit subpar to their card stock, which I wish were a little bit better. But that's a minor quibble, so I'm not going to dock them too much or penalize them too much for that. My number 9 board game publisher, WizKids. And now we move on to my number 8 board game publisher, and that is Stronghold Games. And Stronghold has published a lot of games over the course of the years. They had their I forgot what it's called, the designer series, where they had lots of famous, renowned designers make different games for them that they published in their catalog. Some of my favorites from Stronghold include Survive, the very classic game that got a revamp and republishing about 10 years ago. We have Pursuit of Happiness, a very cool worker placement game, which is basically the game of life for gamers. Players are just living their lives and trying to have quality of life, happiness, if you will, long-term and short-term included. The two tile laying games from Uwe Rosenberg, Cottage Garden and Indian Summer, polyomino games, really cool. Nova Luna, another Uwe Rosenberg game, co-design. Sola Fide, a Reformation-themed deck-building, two-player only game. 504 by Freedom and Freeze, which basically has 504 different modules that players can use in order to play somewhat different gaming experiences each time. And finally, my representative game for Stronghold, and that is Village by the board game designing couple Inca and Marcus Brand. And this is a worker placement game with a medieval setting, village setting, as the title indicates. And players' workers are very interesting in this game because they actually have a lifespan, if you will. They can't die. So you have multiple generations of workers, and as the game progresses, future generations will be available to you. But the earlier generations are going to start to die. And to some extent, you want them to die. You just want to time that death appropriately, and you want to make sure that those workers that die for you had some sort of prestige, some position of honor in their village before they pass away, because that will earn them a place in the chronicle. Because if you run out of space in the chronicle and your workers die, they're going to be buried in these nameless, tombless or tombstoneless plots in the cemetery here, and they're going to be worth no points for you at the end of the game. Really cool how the worker placement works. You actually remove these different colored cubes in order to activate an action, and each of the different cubes kind of work as a resource that you can use later in order to trigger additional actions. So between all of that, the worker placement and the managing of the villagers, or your workers, I should say, and their lifespans, I find that to be really cool. Sometimes it's a little bit sad and grim when you have to lay one of your workers to rest, but hopefully they will have paid dividends for you. And there's lots of things you're managing here. You're managing political life and monastic, or not monastic, but religious life here as well in the cathedral. Lots of different resources that need to be produced for the upkeep of the village. Really cool. Stronghold games, a lot of great collaborations with renowned board game designers. As I mentioned, the designer series. So that's one of the things that I appreciate about Stronghold, this working relationship with lots of other designers that are known for really putting out good stuff out there. My number 8 board game publisher, Stronghold Games. And now we move on to my number 7. And my number 7 is probably not one that is as recognized by other people, or at least not as appreciated by other people, but I really do enjoy this company, and that is GMT Games. And GMT is one of the smaller publishers. They do not do things like Kickstarter, and honestly speaking, they do not massively produce their games. They have a P500 system where their board games don't even get reprinted until they have at least 500 people who pre-order these games. In other words, the demand has to be there before they even go out and waste their resources in order to put out these games. And the card quality and the component quality and the artwork and graphic design is very subpar compared to all of these other publishers, as I mentioned, including Wizkids and Ravensburger. The components are not necessarily pretty. They're not, these games are not lookers, but I enjoy their gameplay. I really enjoy how they work. And some of the games I like 2 different card games by Rainer Knizia, Battle Line and Ivanhoe. I also like 2 games by Jason Matthews, 1960 and Twilight Struggle, both historically themed, both 2-player only experiences, both reflecting some type of card-based combat, although the combat in these games is more of a political nature. The difference between 1960 and Twilight Struggle is that 1960 is strictly a card-based game, while Twilight Struggle, although card play is the heart of the game, there is a little bit of dice rolling in order to resolve particular outcomes. So depending on how you feel about dice, that'll determine which of those 2 you would prefer. I also like Thunder Alley, a card racing game, and I enjoy the card racing theme. I don't really follow NASCAR or keep up with any of that stuff, but in a board game format, I enjoy it. I enjoy games like Formula D and what's this game? The Wolfgang Kramer game. Downforce. Yes, that one, Downforce. Those two games are really fun, but mechanically speaking, they're very simplistic, very light games. Formula D is strictly dice rolling, while Thunder Alley has a lot of intricate card play that players must factor in when they're making their decisions. Not only that, they also have to factor the wear and tear of their vehicles, which is included in Formula D, but I find it to be much more nuanced in Thunder Alley. Again, from a component perspective, you got nice little cars in these aforementioned games, while in Thunder Alley, you just got these little cardboard pieces that represent your cars. But if you can get past that, very enjoyable. And my representative games for this franchise, for this publisher, is the Command and Colors games. Right here, I got Command and Colors Napoleonics. I'm a big fan of the CNC system. Ancients is probably my favorite, even though I'm here holding Napoleonics, which is a fine game itself. And because I enjoy this game, this system so much, this really helps elevate GMT to my number 7. Again, the growing edge for them would be if they had greater components, but because their games are so niche, and I guess they don't have as big and large of clientele or an audience as some of these other publishers, I guess for now, their component quality is always going to be a little bit behind, or probably a lot behind from the other competitors in the industry. My number 7 publisher, GMT Games. Now we move on to my number 6, and my number 6 is Lookout Games. And just like Ravensburger was the Stefan Feld brand, Lookout Games is namely the Uwe Rosenberg brand. Not all of the Lookout games are Uwe Rosenberg, but a lot of them are. Some of my favorite games from Lookout include Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, Caverna, we have Patchwork, Cave versus Cave, or Caverna Cave versus Cave. We have Mercator. I'm a big fan for that game, always trying to champion it. Here's a non-Uwe Rosenberg game, Oh My Goods by Alexander Pfister. Small little card game, probably the smallest game I own in my collection. It's definitely top 5 or so. It's a very small box, not too many cards, and yet that game packs quite a punch. Heavy engine building taking place in that game. Oh my goods. And my number 1 game, my representative for this publisher, is Le Havre. And this is another Uwe Rosenberg game, worker placement, resource management, resource conversion, city building, lots of cool elements that I enjoy in gaming involved in this game. Great game, excellent game. I don't even know if I have a criticism for a lot of my publishers going forward. At this point, I really enjoyed them. But yeah, Lookout Games, their working relationship with Uwe Rosenberg, who happens to be one of my favorite board game designers, that helps a lot to elevate them. And then the few games I've played of theirs that are not Uwe Rosenberg games have been met with much success, at least as far as my eyes are concerned. And that's it for my number 6 board game publisher, Lookout Games. My number 5 board game publisher is Queen Games, and some of the games I enjoyed from them include Respublica, a card-based trading game with Dr. Rainer Knizia as the designer, Paris Connection, a very simple kind of like 18XX game, a train-themed game with a stock market element to it, Chicago Express, which is a next step in that direction as far as 18XX style games are concerned, Escape, the very fun, fast-paced, real-time cooperative game, Treasure Hunter, a fun fantasy-themed card drafting game by Richard Garfield, Kingdom Builder, a fun game about setting up connections and links and scoring points in different ways by designer Donald X. Vaccarino of Dominion fame, Alhambra, the classic former Spiel des Jahres winner by Dirk Henn, a tile-laying game, Shogun, a very fun feudal Japanese themed game where players are basically fighting. They're representing different shoguns who are combating for the different territories in Japan, and has a really cool, neat combat system, combat resolution, where instead of rolling dice or playing cards, you're actually casting cubes into a cube tower, and the colors that come out will determine who wins and how much casualties are suffered. And speaking of a cube tower, my representative game for this game also includes that same mechanism, that same gimmick, if you will, but from a different board game designer, and that is Amerigo by Stefan Feld. And in this game here, you do have the cube tower here, but the cube tower, instead of being used for conflict resolution, this is a good old-fashioned Euro game, this is used to determine the different types of actions that can be taken and how many times those actions can be repeated. And you have lots of different stuff. You have this board, and players are basically representing companions of Americo Vespucci here, and they're trying to colonize these different islands. And you have a modular board. It's always going to look different, and you have different sized islands, and some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. The larger ones are more coveted because they could get you additional benefits, but you're trying to establish connections from where you touch down on a particular island, and also accrue lots of different resources that that particular island produces. And you're doing this by a polyomino tile lane element. You're doing this, you're placing these different multi-sided different types of tiles onto these island spaces in order to cover them and recruit and accrue the different types of resources. Lots of cool things going on, and again, like a typical Stefan Feld game, lots of point salad taking place in this game. Lots of different ways of scoring points. Very fun. From Queen Games, just a very reputable catalog, including some former Spiel des Jahres winners here. If you like Euro games, this is definitely a company that you kind of have to look out for. Queen Games. Now we move on to my number 4 board game publisher, and that is Days of Wonder. And Days of Wonder, the games that I enjoy from them include Pirates Cove, a classic. I actually got it right here. Classic pirate-themed game, long out of print. I'm a big fan of pirate-themed games, and this one executes it pretty well. We have the classic mainstream success Ticket to Ride. You find it anywhere in Target and Walmart and all sorts of different locations. Cleopatra and the Society of Architects, which was originally published by Days of Wonder. They did have a Kickstarter release with a different publisher not too long ago. Shadows over Camelot, a King Arthur themed cooperative game. We have Memoir 44. I mentioned CNC games earlier from the GMT. This is basically the World War II iteration within that same gaming system. Small World, very fun fantasy-themed area control game. Yamatai, a game by Bruno Cathala, Japanese themed. And my representative game for Days of Wonder is another Bruno Cathala game, and that is Five Tribes. Here we have an Arabian themed game. This has the ever so classic Mancala mechanism where players are moving around pieces, in this case different colored meeples, and they're moving them along the different spots on the board, which is a modular grid that you will set up at the beginning of the game. And basically you can move as many spaces as you pick up meeples, dropping one off at a time every space you go. And that final location where you end, the last meeple you drop off there has to match with at least one meeple that's already there. You will remove all the meeples of said color, and then you're going to trigger a particular benefit depending on the color of that meeple. Not only that, but you'll trigger a particular action depending on that final location that you ended on. So you're factoring all these different things in, all these possible options as far as your decisions are concerned, as far as your strategy goes. It's such a beautiful looking game and such a mechanically satisfying game. And that's the thing about Days of Wonder. They do not produce a lot of games. They only publish about one game a year. And even so, they put all of their energy, all of their resources into it. They have great working relationships with lots of established designers. But even when they take a newcomer, they're certain that this game will be a success. And they put a lot into the production and the presentation of the game. All of these games from Days of Wonder, they are very good looking. I'd say overall, as a publisher, they're definitely one of the better publishers as far as the graphic design and the quality of their materials go. My number 3 board game publisher, Days of Wonder. Now we move on to my number 4, I should say. Now we move on to my number 3, and my number 3 is Rio Grande Games. And Rio Grande Games is just really a ubiquitous company. They have published so many games through the years. Some of these games they no longer have the rights to, but if I own the copy to the game from them, then I'm going to be giving them credit. And some of the games that they have published over the years that I enjoy include Puerto Rico, Cuba, Palazzo, Dominion, the grandfather of all the deck building games, Race for the Galaxy by Thomas Lehman, nice engine building, variable phase order, card-based game, Macau by Stefan Feld, Airlines Europe, a nice stock market game by Alan Moon, designer of Days of Wonder, Temporum, a science fiction time travel themed game by Donald X. Vaccarino, same designer as Dominion. Tikal, the former Spiel des Jahres winner of the original Mass Trilogy game by Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer. Tower of Babel, Copycat by Freedom and Fries, Merchants of Amsterdam, Bonanza the Duel, 2-player only iteration of Bonanza, and my representative game for Rio Grande Games is Power Grid by Freedom and Fries, and this is a classic game, over 20 years out there now. Great game. I enjoy everything that's going on in this game. Basically, you are building, establishing your network of power plants in order to provide power to all these different cities. And the board always consists of a map, and there's so many maps out there. You got North America and Germany just in the base game alone. And if you buy expansion maps, you'll be able to go pretty much anywhere in the world. And basically, you're trying to be the player who has the most efficient network of not only cities, but also power plants that provide power to those cities as efficient a manner as possible, because you have all these different types of resources, and some are more costly than others. Right? So you got to factor that all in. But I really enjoy Power Grid. I really enjoy lots of the games that I mentioned here on this list. And I guess that's the thing about Rio Grande. It's just how much games they have designed over the years. They have slowed down in recent years, and they are not the juggernaut they once were. But a lot of these games, these classic games that I appreciate, fall under their catalog, so I will give them credit for that as my number 3 board game publisher. Now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2, although I enjoyed it a lot, I'm going to have to say is a distant second to my number 1 coming up shortly. And my number 2 board game publisher is Z-Man Games. And just like Rio Grande Games, this is a ubiquitous company. So many board game designs, so many games that may no longer be under their catalog. They might not have the rights to any longer. But again, if I own a copy of this game from theirs, if it has their name on the box, then I'm going to give them credit. And some of the games that I played over the years that I enjoyed from Z-Man Games include Kingsburg, the original dice placement game with a fantasy theme. You use dice as your workers. Pandemic, the ever so popular cooperative game about saving the world from viruses, so relevant to our world today. Le Havre Inland Port, a 2-player iteration to Le Havre, and I actually am a pretty big fan of this game, even though nobody else seems to be. Carcassonne, classic tile laying game from over 20 years ago. Still winning over the hearts of many people that play it till this day. Prophecy, a fantasy-themed adventure sandbox-style game from designer Vlada Chvátil. As a matter of fact, I believe this might be his oldest design, and I really enjoy this game. Fields of Arles, the worker placement agricultural-themed game from Uwe Rosenberg. That's not from Lookout, that's not from Mayfair. Instead, we have Z-Man Games to credit for it. 2-player only game unless you buy the expansion, the Tea and Trade expansion, which opens it up for a 3rd player. And then we have Ora and Labora, very heavy worker placement game, again from Uwe Rosenberg, again with a little bit of an agricultural theme, but it's more of a medieval monastic theme. Lots of resource conversion from borrowed over from the game Le Havre, and an interesting worker placement element where you only take 2 actions per round, and those can be 2 worker placement actions, but you have 3 workers, and you don't get all your workers back until you've played all 3 down. And your worker, you have 1 worker that's unique. He's your prior, and he gives you a little bit slight advantage over your other workers. So you want to budget the use of your workers very wisely. El Grande, the classic grandfather to the area majority mechanism. And my representative game here is Marco Polo. I mentioned Kingsburg earlier as the pioneer to the worker placement, dice placement genre. And Marco Polo has taken that genre to another level. Very fun game. They recently had a Marco Polo 2 that is very well renowned as well. Cool game about traveling through the Silk Road, establishing markets, and just managing different resources in order to complete your contracts. This is a contract fulfillment game. And basically, the heart of the game is fulfilling those contracts, because if you complete those contracts, not only do they give you a lot of points, but the person who completed the most contracts at the end of the game will be awarded an additional bonus. So that's some incentive to complete those contracts. Number 2 board game publisher, Z-Man Games. And now we're going to move on to my number 1. And there was just no doubt about it, between the fact that this game has more board games in my collection than probably another 2 or 3 of these publishers combined. Besides the sheer volume of their games, the fact that I actually enjoy lots of their games, it just was a no-brainer. My number 1 board game publisher is Fantasy Flight games. And I'm not going to list all the games that I own for Fantasy Flight games. Instead, I'm just going to list a few, the ones that are most prominent and I enjoy the most. Games like Descent, the standard bearer for many years in the dungeon crawler genre. Runebound, which was the flagship game in that same Terranoff universe that Descent comes from. Arkham Horror File games. I'm just going to lump them all up. Lots of people enjoy these Arkham Horror, Cthulhu Mythos, H.P. Lovecraft themed games, and I am no exception to that. I enjoyed pretty much, I think, every game I've played in the Arkham Horror File games, I enjoy, and I enjoy a lot. I'm going to lump up another group, the living card games, the LCGs. I really enjoy that style of game, and so many of these living card games from Fantasy Flight have been a hit with me. They've had some Euro games that they've worked on or they've published over the years that I enjoy. Games like Tigris and Euphrates, Lord of the Rings from designer Reiner Knizia, Deadwood, a Wild West themed worker placement game. Games Workshop Classics. So Games Workshop, the publisher, UK-based publisher, had a working relationship with Fantasy Flight a few years back, and they republished lots of their older titles with a little bit of a reskin. Sometimes they rebranded it under the Terranoff umbrella, and I enjoy a good amount of games that came out of that partnership with Games Workshop. The Games of Thrones board game. Game of Thrones, very long game, very immersive experience as well. Blue Moon, which is kind of like a tactical CCG style game designed by Reiner Knizia. Android Infiltration and Mission Red Planet, a area control game with some secret character selection, secret role selection, designed by Bruno Cathala and Bruno Faduti. And the representative game for Cosmic Encounter, my favorite game in their design catalog, and that is Cosmic Encounter, the classic alien-themed science fiction space negotiation game. Really cool with lots of variable player powers, a lot of different alien races for players to choose from, lots of opportunities for diplomacy, lots of opportunities for negotiation, lots of opportunities for betrayal. I talk about this game all the time. Fantasy Flight is just so great. Their production, their quality as far as aesthetic, as far as graphic design, their ability and their prominence in the industry to get all of these different licenses, all these intellectual properties from Marvel to Star Wars to Lord of the Rings, all of these very popular things, Game of Thrones. It's just a testament to their success, to the fact that they continue to produce good games in these intellectual properties, and it's just hard for me to resist when I hear that Fantasy Flight is working on a new game. Therefore, they are the absolute and undisputed #1 board game publisher as far as I'm concerned. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here. And when having the board games, please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite board game publisher. What do you think about my 10 favorite board game publishers? And which board game publisher are you surprised that it was omitted from this particular list? Please comment down below. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us here today. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.